Hello, so today we're going to build a pedal from scratch on veroboard. Vero is essentially strips of copper on a board like this, and you can place components through these holes and solder them on the back so that they connect up to each other. And you can break these copper tracks to separate bits out, but essentially it's a method of building up a circuit without a printed PCB. There's a whole heap of archives online where people have translated circuits from schematic format into a veroboard layout. There's places like Tagboard Effects or Dirtbox layouts where there's immense numbers of these layouts where people have taken schematics and translated them for you, so you don't need to figure that bit out. So today we are going to build a relatively simple circuit. It is a VERO Torns Peaker fuzz, which is kind of like a chaotic fuzz. Just wanted something fun and loud, basically. The VERO circuits are a really good way to learn because there's loads of resources about them online. Devi made a lot of that information available years ago, and the circuits themselves are relatively simple, so they're quite easy to put together if you're a first-time builder. So the first thing I do is I grab a Sharpie and I mark out the dimensions of the board so you can count the dots as you go along. So I'll go 10 up first, over from the right hand side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I'll mark a line there. And then it was 15 horizontally. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And then I'm just marking this along because I'm going to go over it with a scalpel to cut this shape out of the veroboard. So I'm going to nab a Stanley knife for this, and then I'm just going to score. Should probably be doing this on a chopping board, but I have to move bits about, or a cutting mat rather. Instead I'll just gouge at my desk. So yeah, 2 or 3 on each side tends to do the... See if that's enough. There we go. And then that just breaks away from the rest of the board. So I'll pop that in a drawer. And then the next thing you want to do is mark out the cuts. So the diagram we're using has the cuts as sort of red squares with a white dot in the center. And you want to mark out that pattern on your board with a Sharpie again. So I'm going 5 along and 4 down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4 down, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'm working my way through this, just marking these cuts out, and I'm going to make the cuts with a drill bit on the back side of this board. And normally you will have the dimensions, so I've got 15 by 10 on the diagram here. You'll have the number of cuts and the number of links. We'll get to links in a sec, but for now we're looking at this and it's got 11 cuts. It's highly likely that there are much more sensible ways of doing this, but I am not very sensible. So now that we've marked those out, I'm going to grab a drill bit, just a regular drill bit that I'm going to use my hand to cut away at the copper here. So when you've marked this with a Sharpie, I'm not sure if this will show on a camera, but you can actually see those Sharpie marks coming through the board, and if you can't see them, I tend to just grab a bit of wire or a resistor leg and I'll just poke them through to the other side so I know where I'm going to be cutting. So once you've designated the spot you're cutting, you just by hand, a couple of turns with the drill bit, and you'll break the track, so you can see that the left hand side is not connected to the right hand side anymore. You can check that with the multimeter in continuity mode, and if it's still connected it'll beep, but I'm pretty confident looking at that visually that it's okay. So I'll just work through these cuts. Probably don't want to breathe or eat any of this dust that's sort of breaking off into you. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Oh, that's it. That's all the holes. So you can visually check to see if they are connected, and like I mentioned earlier, you can use a multimeter. So I'll just grab one now, because it's a pretty good skill to learn. Not that it takes much skill to do, but using a continuity mode on a multimeter, it's just super useful. So I'm going to this mode that's got the little yellow lines here. They'd be whatever colour. Some multimeters have a specific mode for this, but this shares it with other modes. So I'm clicking here and I'm pressing function until I've got that little loudspeaker sort of, I don't know what you'd call that. Anyway, this little orange icon. So I've got that here. So this means that when these two prongs are connected, it'll beep to tell me that that connection is there. So if I go along this board, I can check that I've made the cuts and that nothing is connected anymore. So I'm just going either side of each cut just to make sure that each section is isolated from each other. So I'll go there. Always makes me feel a bit like a dentist when I use one of these. Cool, so no beeps, so all those cuts are successful. We'll pop that to the side because we might want him again. So next up is the links, and I've bought, I'll pop that there, just straight copper wire that I chop up for these, but you can use resistor legs or any component legs as well. Just find this easier, and this is a bit thicker as well, so easier to mess about with. So we had 4 links, I believe. So the first one's in this corner here. 1, 2, 3. And I'm just using the pliers just to bend this wire so that it sits where I want it to. And then once I've popped those through the holes, I'm flipping that over. I'm going to have to turn this iron on and wait for it to heat up, but I'm going to solder these in place. So whilst that's cooking, or achieving the correct temperature, I guess, I'll just chop off another 3 bits of this. So these are connecting the strips to each other. So now, once I've soldered this in, this strip here and this strip will be connected. You can sort of use the Sharpie marks for the cuts as guidance now, so you know where to pop these links in. You'll also notice that my soldering iron is on my left hand side, even though I'm right handed, which I'm sure people will complain about, but that's the side of my plugs, so that's the side that I've always used. Top tip as well, I always keep pot lids from spray paint to use as little bins, so as I'm doing this and chopping bits of legs off, I can just pop them into those and then just chuck them in the bin at the end. It saves the desk just becoming sort of unworkable with little bits of metal. So yeah, you really want to take your time with this. I'm definitely rushing through it, which probably isn't a good idea. And if it's your first sort of build, you want to take as much time as possible to make sure that everything is being cut and linked in the correct areas, because well, you'll find out when it comes to the end, if it doesn't work, it's quite frustrating to work back then until you can find what you've done wrong. Cool, so this is what you'll have after you've done that. It's upside down, but if you look back at the diagram, you can compare this board back to that to make sure that all your links are in the same place, you've got the correct amount of links, and just double check that they correspond to the cuts in the correct way as well. So when you're building on VEROboard, you want to use the shortest components, or populate the shortest components first and build it up height-wise, essentially just because it's easier to flip it over when everything's the same height and solder it in place, otherwise everything falls out and flops about. You can still do it, it's just a bit more awkward. So I'm going to start with diodes and resistors, which are the same sort of dimension-wise. The diagrams tend to have any unlabeled components listed at the bottom. So the one diode is a 1N5817, which is a polarity diode, so that's just protects the circuit if you put in, if the power supply plugged into it is the incorrect polarity. So 1N5817 is going to pop in here, and this is a component that has an anode and a cathode, so it's polarized, so you want to make sure that the strip corresponds to your diagram, the little silver strip here, so that is going to the top of the diagram, so I'll pop that in there first. We'll solder him in place. So I'm just working through, pushing the component through, soldering it in place and snipping its legs off. So I'll go for the diodes next. So I tend to look at it, look how many of the same value I've got. I tend to keep a bank of values. If you're ordering values in, I'd recommend always ordering like 10 times as much as you need, because you'll always need them again. So if I needed a 10k resistor, I'd always order at least 10, if not more, and they're cheapest chips, so you might as well stock up on them. So this circuit uses two 10k, so we'll grab that from these drawers. It is worth nabbing some of these drawers. The component drawers, they do just make life infinitely easier when you're trying to look for parts, and also getting a little label maker or something, so you don't have to try and, well, it depends how tidy your handwriting is actually, but so you don't have to try and decipher any messy handwriting. And then another 10k right in the center. Cool, so those are the two 10Ks, and then we've got 1, 2, 3, 400Ks. If you aren't particularly great at looking at the little coloured stripes on these resistors, which are sort of designators so that you know what value each resistor, and you can just check it with a multimeter as well. So I'll just show you that quickly, because that's also a useful thing. So I'll set this to the little ohm symbol here, and pop these on either side of the resistor, and it should read roughly 100k. So we've got 100.4. So we know that that's the correct value. There's always going to be part tolerance depending on the resistors that you use. I think these are 1%, so that sounds correct. And now I'm going to pop these in. So I've just noticed that one of these holes has been blocked with solder, so I'm going to use this solder sucker to suck it out. You could also use a desoldering needle. But yeah, so just heat it up, click the back. I got this from Thunk in the UK. It's some sort of Japanese solder sucker, but it's probably the best one I've ever used. So yeah, this can get quite tedious eventually, especially when boards get bigger, because they can get huge for bigger circuits. This is a relatively simple one, and there's also simpler than this again, which is what I would recommend you start with. Something like a boost, like an LPB1 Electro-Harmonics linear power booster, or something like a super hard-on ZVEX booster. It's a pretty simple and easy one to build, and sounds good. And then two of these big boys. Okay, so have I got all the resistors? 10k, 2M2, 100k, 100k, 10k. Yeah, all the resistors are in. So next up I am going to go for the transistors. So I'm going to solder these straight in, but when you are first starting out building, I'd recommend nabbing some sockets. Yeah, so these sockets come in these little strips, and you can sort of chop them off. So you would chop off 3 pins for a transistor, and on your diagram you've got a list of the transistors. So we've got 2 MPSA18s, which is a pretty standard transistor in the Devi sort of universe. 2 of those, and then we've got 2 of these 2N2222A. Obviously they look pretty identical when you get them out, but you can read the designator on the component itself. So Q1 and Q2 are MPSA18, so I'll pop those in first. On this particular diagram, it looks like, well, I think this is the case for most of them, but the designator for each transistor will be just off the board. So for example, Q1, the marking for that is just underneath the board. So I'll pop that in here at the bottom. It's just to the right of this link. And then the second MPSA 18. And you also want to make sure that the orientation is correct. So you'll notice that the transistors have one flat side and one rounded side, and that will correspond to your diagram. So I'm just sort of roughly popping these in. If you're doing this for the first time, I'd recommend, well, obviously using sockets, but if you're not using sockets, then solder these in one at a time. It just makes life easier, but I like life on hard mode. Impatient. When you come to the end, you want to look at all these tracks and make sure that nothing's overlapping where it shouldn't be. So we've got all those transistors in. Like I said, they're not particularly straight, but that shouldn't really matter. And we're going to move on to the film capacitors next. So I use these box film caps, but so the ones that I use look like this. So I've got 300 nanofarads. You'll also notice I'm not using any sort of extractor fan. You definitely should be doing that, but that would make the audio terrible. To make sure I've got the board the right way around, that's a common occurrence, is popping something in, soldering it on, and then realising you're on the wrong side of the board, which is fun. Cool, and then all we've got left to pop on then is the electrolytic capacitor. So I'm going to use this big fat chunky boy. It's just doing the power filtering, so that is every component on there. The next thing we need to do is the offboard wiring, which is where a lot of issues tend to occur. We'll pop the pots on first. So the way that the pots work is, so the values will be listed at the bottom. So we've got a 500 kB and an 100 Ka for the volume. So 100 Ka, in the pot value is a logarithmic pot, B is a linear pot, and C is a reverse log rhythmic. I've got a bunch of pots in this component, these component drawers up here. So that's the A100K, so that's the volume pot, and then we want a B500, A100. So you'll notice that there's 3 prongs coming off of these, or 3 lugs or legs, and if you were to count them, so they're all numbered on this there, and it's from the top side you'd go 1, 2, 3, and when you're looking at it from the underside, which is if you're soldering it into the box itself, you'll probably be looking at the underside. It's the other way around, so from the left to right it's 3, 2, 1. So that corresponds to the numbers on the diagram. So for instance, volume 3 is up at the top right hand side of our diagram, and that would come to this lug here. So it's a wire from the circuit to here. Generally a volume circuit is wired where the third lug is taken from the output of the circuit. The second is the output that's going to your foot switch, and the first lug is going to ground, so because it's essentially just turning the circuit down. So for a lot of these diagrams you won't see the output labelled, but this one is labelled, but it would generally be coming off of the second or the middle leg of the volume pot. So we're going to pop some wires into this. I'm just going to snip some random sort of lengths. We'll just give it enough length that we can sort of mould it to wherever we want it to go. So I'm going to go twice the length of the board perhaps. So I'm just stripping the tips of those, and I'm going to pop these wires into our board. So we're going to do the pots before we do any other connections. So the volume connection is on the top right, so it's coming from this leg of this capacitor. So we're going to pop that wire in there, solder him in place. So it's only 2 wires going to this volume, because the other one is going to be wired to the foot switch. The other volume connection is still on the right hand side but further down, so that will be connected to the ground. You also don't need to connect that ground lug to the board. You could just connect it to any other grounding sort of point in your pedal, so that could be coming off of the power supply or off any of the jacks. So I'm going to flip this round and I'm just going to put a little dob of solder on the back of these. You can get pots sort of designed to have wires soldered onto them, which I would recommend doing rather than this, but I mean, you just use what you can. And then we'll get the wires on the other side. And then we're going to do the same as we did with the volume pot. So that's going on there, because that's the final one there. Cool, so that's the pots. They're just sort of loosely attached on there for now. And then we've got one toggle, and the toggle is an SPST. So an SPST switch, it means single pole, single throw. So whatever is wired to this middle point here, when this is pointing upwards, these two lugs are connected, and then once it's pointing downwards, these two are connected. So it's sort of the opposite of whatever this switch is pointed. That's the lugs that are connected to each other. So we'll start with the middle one here. So it doesn't really matter which way around you do this, but I'm going to go switch 2 and I'm going to put that on the middle. Him in the middle there. And then the outer. The layout itself is working. Like I said, it shouldn't matter because you're only making one connection anyway. So I'm going to put the lower connection onto that lug 2, so just popping that through the lug. Getting some solder on it. And then the other one. Again, it doesn't matter which way around you do this. So when this is down, these two lugs are connected, and when it's up, they're not. Every single board has 4 connections: an input to the circuit, an output to the circuit, power input, and a ground connection. Ground 9 volts and input connections are up here. I keep these wires excessively long to begin with because I'm going to wire this circuit into my breakout box, which is a little device I use to test the circuit before I put it in an enclosure. We'll pop those connections in there, and then I'll tin this and add that to the volume pot, which is the output of this circuit. And then that is it for soldering for the time being, and this is where we're at. You may want to label these. I'm just going to put a big old V for volume, T for texture, and then we're going to wire it into our breakout box. This box essentially enables me to plug my guitar into the circuit without it needing to be in an enclosure. I'm going to quickly I've got a drawer of just either broken or weirdo knobs that I just keep on hand because it makes things easier to test because you can see where the knob is pointing, but you could also just, draw on them with a Sharpie. That's the same difference. Once that's in, we're going to plug our guitar in. So we'll turn on the amp. You might want to use some sort of cheaper little combo amp or something for this, because I know people are worried about their speakers, and I am an irresponsible man. Will it work? So we've got very low output, so we're going to need to do some troubleshooting to get this working. Cool. So it's not working, which shouldn't let discourage you, because we're going to look at this now and we're going to figure out why it's not working. Cool, so when I flipped this over, I noticed, you can probably see it there, that I've missed a resistor leg wasn't soldered. So I've soldered that in. We're going to pop this on. Here's my clean tone. Is it in tune? Nobody knows. let's put it in a box. I've got two big knobs. I'm going to find an enclosure. Would that be hilarious? I think I might just go huge. I'm going to do this incredibly roughly. I'll drill the holes slightly too big for these pots because I'll inevitably drill them wonky. I tend to get my enclosures just pre-drilled. Meters down myself. So it's 14 and a half. Oh, it is working. Doing it like an idiot. And that's it for now, and we're going to use these big knobs. Right, so we've got our enclosure, we've got our circuit, some knobs, and we need to wire a foot switch. So first things first, I'm going to just pop a foot switch in here, and I like to use these little LED bezels, but whatever, make your own mind up about what you like. So just grab a foot switch from down here. So I'm just using an alpha toggle switch, just a very generic component. And I'm going to unscrew him. So I tend to mount the foot switch in first, which will make sense in a second. I like to use these Peppers sockets for basically everything because they just don't scratch a powder coat. I've got the bezel in, foot switch in, and then we've got the pot holes and the toggle which are connected to this currently. So the next bit I'm going to do is I'm going to wire the foot switch. So these were the four connections I was talking about earlier. You've got input, output, power and ground. I'm just going to wire the foot switch traditionally. I tend to keep a little diagram of how the foot switch is wired up above me and a little conversion chart for capacitors at all times, because it's just the sort of thing that's super simple, but sometimes I just can't remember. So just find it easier to do this. If also, I'll pop that diagram up in the bio. There's a few jumpers you may want to do, which I will use resistor legs to make, but they're just, you could also just use wire, it's just a bit tidier with a resistors leg. Right, so I've mounted the hardware, the pots have been screwed on with a washer and a nut, the toggle switch has also been screwed on with a nut. I'm just starting on the foot switch wiring here. There'll be a diagram in the bio. Next up I need to wire the power from the board into the DC jacks. So the way these DC jacks work for wiring, this bigger piece here, the bigger lug, that's always your ground connection, and then the one furthest from it is where you want to wire your power. This is if you're using a battery, so we're just going to completely ignore this middle lug, but ground here, power here, and all the ground connections inside the enclosure all need to be connected to each other. If you're using a powder coated enclosure like this, you'll want to scrape away some of the paint around this drill hole, because then these jacks are connected through their ground lugs basically. But you're going to want to connect the DC to the ground on here. The ground on here also needs to be connected to one of these jacks. They should connect, like I said, through the case, and then you're also going to have a grounding point on the foot switch as well. So I'm going to ground to whatever's close to me, so we'll ground to this here, and I'm going to go from this jack as well over to the DC jack. Solder that up. So I'm just wiring the ground lug of the jack over to the ground lug of the DC jack, and then the ground connection on the board is also going up to this jack. So if I get one of these jacks that haven't been soldered, so this flattened corner here is always your ground connection, and then the furthest opposite on this left hand side here, that is your tip. This is the, if it's this way around, input this side, output this side, so it's left to right when you're looking at it from the innards. So you've got your input and your output, so in's going to go to the foot switch and the out's also going to go to the foot switch. So following the diagram, I've wired my circuit to the circuit in and the circuit output, so we'll do the output jack next. It could be beneficial to use coloured wire for different connections. I tend to just use black for everything because I am a 24-hour goth, and I think it looks nicer. Sure, so that's those connections. All we need to do now is to wire the LED. So we'll grab an LED. Doesn't matter what size it is, whatever you prefer. And we're also going to need a current limiting resistor. So I tend to use 4K7 as a value, or 4.7K, because that's the brightness that I like. So we're essentially going to wire the current limiting resistor to this top lug here. That's going to go to the, I like to make these little loops which you can just thread that through, so that's going to go to the cathode of the LED, or the negative leg, so that will be the shorter leg, and then this leg is going to be connected straight to power. Shouldn't matter which way around the current limiting resistor is, so long as it's in the circuit, so it can either be between the LED and the power connection, or it could be between the LED and ground. Soldering an extra bit of wire onto that power leg, and that's coming down to this LED. Cool, so all we need to do now is connect a ground wire to this middle lug on the left hand side and connect these two lugs together. I'm going to wire this to the ground lug on this jack, which should be connected to everything else through the enclosure. So that's that there, and then the final piece of the puzzle is just a case of connecting these two lugs on the bottom of the foot switch together. So I'm going to do the same trick as I did when I was making the jumpers for the board, or the links rather, and I'll just do it with a resistor leg, fold it into a little U and shove that between the two. And then I'll solder that in place and I'll snip off the excess. Super messy, big elephant ears for the off-board wiring there, but this should work when we plug it in. And so that's that, and then we'll plug it in, double check it works, and that's it, we're done.